Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this last lecture in the International Marketing module. What we're going to do here is have two sets of videos. One is going to be me going over the lecture materials and Demetria going over the case materials. These will be broken into two parts. And effectively, if you want to sort of kind of say, well, what is it I should keep as, the only piece of materials I have from this course? Well, I would say it's this lecture, because it really kind of attempts to give you the things that are really kind of the nuts and bolts, what it is you really need to know. And while you might want more detail in each individual area, this is kind of a holistic perspective. Now, when you look at marketing across organizations, there actually are different levels at which you can think about this. We haven't talked about this in a lot of detail, but effectively what you have is you have different types of pressure points in terms of how you're thinking about things. At the corporate level or at the headquarters level, you have a lot of discussion of strategy, structure, and organization. And in the marketing literature, this pops up as a notion around market orientation. And that is that how are you oriented in terms of the nature of your customers and the variety of markets in which you're operating. So there is a literature that talks about market orientation or marketing orientation, which we've kind of encompassed within some of the discussion around the nature of sort of kind of the strategic orientation of the firm, which I'll come back to in a minute. At the business unit level, you hear many people talking about things like marketing strategy. And at this point, this is really where the segmentation, targeting, and positioning as a general phenomenon kind of comes into play. So it's the strategic business unit level. It could also be the market level, if that is the really the breakdown of the businesses in some sense. But generally speaking, it's a lot smarter to at least think about this at one level, coming from the line of business, whatever that might be, typically being a product or a product category, and then to break it up in other ways. And then there's the operational or product level. And this is where the marketing mix issues start to come in. Product, place, promotion, price are all in this part of the mix. And this is really kind of the lectures that we did on image, pricing, franchising in terms of structure, place in terms of distribution, so on and on. These all come in at this point. Now, the real issue ultimately, though, is if you look at the stuff on the prior slide, this could apply within any specific country. And really where the complexity of international marketing comes in, and also international management more generally, is in terms of the additional complexity and interactions and conflicts that all arise at the international level. And this is what I talked about in these sets of figures here in the first lecture. Effectively, if you ignore everything here and you just concentrate on what's down here, you're really dealing with the local context. And a lot of corporate strategy, if you've taken a corporate strategy course or even a strategic management course, will focus on this aspect. This is where notions, for example, of strategic fit come in. And that is, the firm essentially adapts to local economic, political, cultural, market conditions. And effectively what this is a kind of local market phenomenon. And when you see a lot of the kind of frameworks you get in typical strategy classes, you do an internal analysis, external analysis, you do a Porter's 5 forces, you do SWOTs, you do matrices. All of these things kind of apply, or can be applied in these types of environments. As soon as you break out of these types of environments, though, you've got problems. So this might be true within any one market, But the question, of course, is, well, what happens when you move into another market where there are different local conditions, different politics, different culture? How does this firm's strategic disposition, in terms of the fact that it's adapted to this local environment, how does it operate here? And this is where the big pressure points start to come on the firm, and that is that unless these two things are very, 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 very close together, in the sense that, the foreign markets look very much like the local markets, then you have a problem in that the firm's strategic disposition is out of whack with respect to the markets in which it's operating. And in this example here, I've got them completely separate. So what's going on in this market is very different from what's going on in this market. The firm ultimately has to drift away and try to have a disposition which overlaps these markets, which means that it's changing all these things that are inside its disposition, its own organizational culture, adapting its history, maybe changing technology, structure, the distributions of its businesses, the kind of products it's offering. All of these types of things will have to be altered to kind of fit into these local for local conditions, but also across kind of variety of local environments. And this is one argument that I always make for why, when you look at multinational corporations, they seem to perennially be in a process of reorganization. And the answer that I usually give as to the why of that is simply because the firm has to keep balancing its disposition as its portfolio changes. If its portfolio isn't changing, then it'll simply drift along with whatever changes are going on in the markets it's in. But ultimately, that isn't going to work. And if the firm's really trying to seek growth, or it's kind of deciding which markets it's going to exit, then it's going to have to kind of change the disposition of its operations. And this is where this complexity starts to change notions of strategy, of a strategy for a firm. Kind of having a, you go through the Porter's analysis and all of these types of things. And one reason why we don't cover that sort of stuff in the class is simply because it really doesn't have much value when you're starting to do these types of more complex multinational operations. It changes the nature of the operational details of sort of kind of what it means to develop a strategy. How do you do internal analysis and external analysis when you get 150 different markets? And the internal structure, your internal analysis, essentially is endogenous, in the sense that you can't separate the external from the internal very easily. And also the operational details of just making all of this work. How do you sort of kind of plan all that? And this is why, when you look at the liability of foreigners logics, typically what you find, and this is kind of an average effect, is that when you look at the margin that a firm earns, a multinational earns, as it expands its distance from its home market, and again, distance from home market is being defined not only by geography, but really what the firm does. In other words, the closeness of these differences. What you see is the returns decline, and this ultimately implies that actually the firm at the margin is not going to be earning as much as it internationalizes. So the idea that what you're doing is you're making bigger returns in foreign markets than you are in your home market, generally speaking, is not true. And this is the liability of foreignness. In other words, the more foreign you become, the lower the return. And then the question, of course, is, well, why does that exist? And the answer is very simple. And that is that if you kind of break things into two simple things, and that is the kind of what we do, which says something about the internal disposition of the firm and its technology and everything, and what the market wants, which is what the market that you move into want. As the firm expands, there will be a gap between what the market wants and what the company does. And so the question actually for the firm is, well, which path do they really want to follow here, or what combination of paths? And that is, do they follow a firm-centric path, which is that they do what they do, and they simply accept the fact that as they move further from their markets, they're going to get, let's say, lower market share? Um, and but they're really going to go for the efficiencies associated with doing the same thing in market after market, or are they going to follow a more market centric path where what they do is they engage in adaptation, okay, where the markets kind of drag them into an adaptive mode. But as soon as you get it dragged into an adaptive mode, you might be able to keep your market share high, but you're going to have to increase the complexity. In other words, you're going to have to be more local for local. Whereas here you don't worry about being local for local. What that does, of course, is that increases the complexity cost. So in one case, you sacrifice the revenues and the market share. In the other case, you don't sacrifice revenue and market share, but you take on more and more and more costs. And in both of those cases, of course, this is why you get this downward trend. Now, also, when you look at it from a marketing perspective, it starts to change all these different kind of P's and C's. The customers are different. What it is the company is, its disposition is changing. Competitors may be different from market to market. The notion of what the product is may differ. One market it may be a luxury product, in another market it may not. The notion of place in terms of where is it being sold, how's it being distributed, the pricing, promotion, advertising, all of these things will be changing, particularly things like advertising and image, which affects obviously the product as well. All of these things start to have an added level of complexity that in singular types of markets, in local markets, it simply isn't the case. And therefore you end up looking at this in a much more nuanced and a much more complicated way. So all of the stuff that you learn in a lot of the basic courses of marketing, or you learn the basic courses of strategy, you start to have to chuck a lot of that stuff out the window, simply because this complexity starts to force different types of trade-offs and different types of decisions. And effectively, part of what this is this push and pull between the economics of standardization, kind of the production economics, which focus you much more on things like economies of scale and economies of scope, and the kind of pull factors which drive you more towards the customers, which are really related to the heterogeneity of the customers, where adaptation may be more demanding. Generally speaking, the economics of production dominates a bit more in B2B markets, whereas the economics of adaptation clearly puts a lot of pressure on you with respect to consumer markets. And this shows up in a kind of three-dimensional way. You have seen kind of a bit of discussion around global integration, local responsiveness in prior classes. The approach that we use is a bit different, in the sense that the global integration factors are really kind of these economics of production. They're driven by economies of scale and scope and efficiency types of goals. The local responsiveness aspect is driven by the economics of adaptation, and essentially driven by the diversity of different customers, their density of usage, how they use the product, and on down the line. So this one is driven by kind of the pull of heterogeneity. This one's given by the pull of standardization, economies of scale. But these two things alone don't necessarily tell you how you're structured or what you do. What they do is they give you a kind of a general strategic decision about the degree of centralization and adaptation that you want to have in terms of the nature of your overall orientation. Do you want to emphasize returns associated with scale, or do you want to emphasize returns associated with adaptation? But ultimately, there's a disintermediation effect, and that is, well, all right, how do I organize around these types of things? So in a lot of the early kind of Bartlett-Goschel stuff, they talked about global integration, local responsiveness. It turns out that is actually not enough to make a decision around strategy and structure. You need also to look at the nature of what we call transactional completeness, but effectively start to ask the question about, do I own, rent, or buy components of the value chain. And these three things together, particularly this transactional completeness, tells you sort of kind of, okay, well, how do I structure myself here? And here are four examples of this, which we talked about. And that is, I can have one structure where I own everything. I internalize all the activities of the value chain from, kind of sourcing to the customer. In another situation, I might own contiguous parts. I might own the upstream operational aspects of this. I might hold the intellectual property and things like that. And then I export it, or I use somebody else to sell it to the customer. In this case here is an example where I simply own the front end and the back end, but I outsource, for example, the manufacturing. So I own the IP, I own the design, I own materials, I control all that. I also control the retail operations, but I don't control production. And then the last one is I actually engage in what's known as an architectural structure, where I simply own the parts, or sorry, I own the structure, but I don't own the parts. In other words, what I do is I basically, I'm almost like Virgin in some sense. I'm kind of an overarching structural owner, but I don't necessarily need to own the bits and the pieces. And the nice thing about these types of markets, right? In these types of kind of views of things, is that even within the same firm, I can actually do all four, as an example. Okay, there are many more variations of this, of course. So in different markets, I could actually choose different structures, and companies do this. And I've given examples of this, particularly with the brewing industry, where these types of structures, you see multiple structures based upon the institutional environment in which the brewer is operating in. But also, I have to look at and ask the question, what am I getting from this in terms of what it is I'm doing, in the sense that I can say, well, what I want to do is I want to make my money on economies of scale. And if I'm going to make my money on economies of scale, I could do it in this way, right? Like, I could own everything, I could own parts, I can do this, but I can still want to make my money on economies of scale. When I break this up, when I choose one or another, or a mix of these things, I'm really asking the question is the market the best way to operate things, or do I need to internalize it within the firm? So all of these things kind of lead to different structures. Different structures also lead to different marketing plans, different marketing strategies, different operational aspects in the nature of the marketing, in terms of what it is that I'm doing, what it is I'm controlling and not controlling. And we also talked about the kind of the pros and cons of different approaches. And as you move from kind of the top of these, which is exporting, to the bottom of these, which is kind of direct ownership, the key here is that you're engaging in distance. Distance from customer increases. Distance from key data increases. Control of local operations, they rise. Here, I get more control from direct investment than I do exporting. Okay. And speed of adjustment and reaction is faster down here than it is up here. Okay. So what this means is, it means that there's actually kind of no free lunch in terms of these entry models. So a mixture of sort of disintermediating the value chain and choosing different ownership structures are effectively telling me that I'm making a trade-off here. I'm making a trade-off of aspects of control, aspects of kind of closeness to customer, and the costs that I'm going to be willing to bear. And it also affects my speed of adjustment. So if I'm in a market where I need very quick speed of adjustment, exporting isn't necessarily going to be a very good option for me. Now, if you look at the marketing function within this, there are a number of things to kind of keep in mind. I tend to not like the term marketing strategy, so I tend to refer to it kind of as marketing function, or kind of the tactical aspects of marketing. But there are a couple of points here. There's no such thing as a global marketing strategy. Okay, it effectively reflects downstream operational and tactical components of a firm's global strategy. Okay, so there's a tendency, in a lot of the literature to overplay the word strategy. I tend to want to keep strategy as a term held at the very top of the organization. So that the organization has a strategy, but it doesn't really have a marketing strategy. It basically has tactical execution using the marketing function, which allows it to achieve its overall strategic objectives. It will be imperfect in terms of the pressures. Right? There's always, in the case of marketing, a desire to get closer to customers. Okay, and the customer centricity logic, which you'll have seen in a video in the synchronous class, gets at this point. In other words, you can have a model of servicing customers and getting close to customers, okay, but you also make choices about which customers you don't serve. Attempting to serve too many customers in too many disparate locations essentially puts you into the local for local category. And in that sense, the multinational loses, because the multinational essentially simply becomes a federation of local companies with an additional cost tossed onto the top. Marketing requires guile in the sense that it's done when you can do the same thing to be tailored to different needs. So you kind of have a core product, and you vary around the core product in some sense. You can allow for customer customization on the part of the customer. You don't necessarily have to engage in that yourself. It also requires a broader understanding of things like culture, national markets, regional markets, and segments, in terms of adding something in that is more meaningful than simply having a country by country strategy. The best companies don't have country-based strategies. They look beyond that to see kind of something more nuanced. And also, marketing has a core kind of informational component, in the sense that it taps into customers, in the sense that customers provide you with information about themselves. This has become more critical in digital marketing, but it allows you to do a lot more in terms of the customers being the ultimate source of value and data, so you can extract knowledge from them. But also, because you're doing things potentially in different ways, for example, disintermediating the value chain, you're more likely to engage in learning and knowledge sharing between organizational units when you have someone who's closer to the customer and someone who's closer to the production. Now, the second thing that we talked about was culture, and culture, is a very vague notion, even though there are definitions of it which are mostly methodological rather than meaningful. So you have kind of general concepts of culture, and then you have kind of very specific types of measurement, and these two things don't match up very well. So generally speaking, culture ends up as an umbrella term that addresses issues of things like etiquette, customs, ways of thinking, ways of doing, and shared systems of meanings amongst groups of individuals. Okay, and it's also something that is learned and imprinted. In other words, it's not just individual. It's something for which there's similarities across individuals, and there are many different layers associated with this. So a lot of the international literature talks about national culture, but I tend not to view that as really meaningful. It's more these kind of tribal cultures of different groups associated with, your professions, the regions you live in, the dialects that you speak, your education background. All of these things are essentially individual level kind of manifestations of various groups to which you belong. And culture matters a lot in the marketing context, because it is something about the individual. So when you're talking about getting at the individual's consumption patterns. You're really looking at them as individuals and getting reflections of what it is that they value. And a lot of that will be related to a mixture of the cultures in which they find themselves. And this will show up in lots of different types of ways. And it will show up in how customers react, how they spend, whether they spend individually, they spend in groups, or what family structures look like, and so on down the line. All these things become very important once you get into the nitty gritty of selling to those individuals. And it also points out kind of a difference between this notion of a priori and a posteriori segmentation, targeting, and positioning. That a lot of the work that has existed up to this point in time is very much a priori. In other words, what you do is you kind of cluster people into similar groups, and then you make grand statements about those groups, as opposed to looking at things at a more behavioral and individual level, which is really where a lot of the marketing is going today. And what that means is that you want to also take the culture and the value and think about it more as a manifestation of something which shows up around individual behaviors. And this is the kind of the big difference probably between what I view culture as and what you might have seen it before. I tend to look on it as operating at the individual level, right? So you have individuals who possess latent tendencies on cultural dimensions, okay? And you can think about individuals as sort of kind of probabilistically being likely to manifest those things. These tendencies are aggregated and manifest in different contexts. And then these are conditional about the beliefs about others, right? So you have kind of this complex set of circumstances where individuals, have kind of learned things and had things imprinted and been parts of various groups, like, fans of football teams, rockers, their cultural heritage, education, what they do in terms of society, their age cohorts, what generation they are, all sorts of things, right? All of these things, can have similarities across individuals, but individuals will have their own kind of underlying variation on these things. And then the question becomes, well, where do these things manifest themselves? And are there kind of constraints around how it is that they're manifested? So for example, in certain types of environments, individuals may have very wide latent beliefs about things, for example, about gender equality, but then they find themselves operating in a relatively paternalistic, authoritarian country. The fact that we don't see them manifesting these things doesn't necessarily mean they don't have them. You may find individuals who appear to be highly collectivist, but that may be simply due to the incentives associated with the environment in which they find themselves. They could be highly individualistic, but they behave as if they're highly collectivist because they don't have a means by which to manifest their individuality. So this is something that from a marketing standpoint becomes very important, because what you want to do is you want to get at these latent tendencies. You don't want to stereotype people based upon kind of rough and really rather limited ways of kind of characterizing behavior. And then from the standpoint of these beginnings, we moved into segmentation, targeting, positioning, which is kind of the core of marketing. So it really doesn't matter whether it's international or kind of standard marketing. And we talked about segmentation, right? So there are different types of segmentation you can think about. There's a kind of pulling equilibrium associated with segmentation, and that is, you might have a bunch of individuals who are very different, but the economics imply that they get the same thing. So it simply may be that you can't manufacture efficiently a variety in the product categories, and therefore everybody gets the same thing. So the price would be too high if you tailored the products. And then there's kind of a separation aspect of this. So the pulling part of this is kind of the uninteresting part. The separating one is the more interesting part. And that is, it's based upon the fact that users are different and hence demand different things. And you can separate those individuals in one of two ways. One way is forced segmentation, and that is individuals are divided by the producer in some manner, um, and on some aspects of design, product pricing, promotion, place, etc. And this is typically done a priori. So what you do is you do an analysis and you define who these individuals are, and then you simply force individuals to sort of kind of purchase certain types of things. And this is done, for example, by simply not making products available in certain locations, or to price them in such a way that they will lead to kind of an enforced difference. And then there's kind of natural separation. And in this situation, firms, what they do is they provide different menus of items, and individuals actually simply select the items which best fit their demand. There may be no a priori analysis associated with this, in the sense that what a company might do is, a company like an insurance company would simply provide you with different co-payment options, different things that can be or cannot be insured, um, and on down the line, and you simply choose the best one for you. And they may offer 150 different choices. And the fact that there are 150 different choices doesn't mean they might sell 150 different products. It simply leads to a set of circumstances in which those 150 options put on the table are kind of meant to get people to reveal differences in their preferences. Airlines do this, for example, with baggage fees, or different pricing options, whether you purchase in advance, who you purchase by, and on down the line. But what ultimately behind all of this is an acknowledgement that customer needs and wants and preferences are heterogeneous. Right? The second aspect of this is that groups of customers actually will have similar needs, and similar wants and similar preferences. So while everybody is unique, there are correlations, in the sense that certain individuals are similar. The question, of course, is whether you can see the similarity. In many cases, you can't see the similarity. Market segmentation is this process by which customers are divided into smaller groups. So you ideally want to have segments which are reasonably homogeneous, but are different from other segments. Right? And the other aspect of this, of course, is that individuals do change their minds, or they do have variety-seeking aspects. And therefore, individuals are not going to necessarily be absolutely in different segments, but effectively will be probabilistically within segments. And some will have a higher probability of being in certain segments as opposed to others. Now, there are a priori approaches which are based upon things you can see generally. So demographics and geography, psychographics, and essentially these are things which are kind of related to observables. And then you have a posteriori approaches, which is what is otherwise known as behavioral segmentation, which what you're doing is you're allowing individuals to sort of select, and you're not relying so much on observables, but you're relying on behaviors to give you information about what it is that the individual is doing. Now, companies tend to mix these. They tend to use a bit of a priori and a bit of a posteriori. In terms of sort of kind of digital marketing, much more of it's a posteriori, because the data is coming in very quickly, and therefore you want to move, you want to get immediate kind of observable data on the nature of behaviors, but also you can get a lot of data on behaviors, and therefore you can base your segmentation on behaviors rather than things like intentions. And when you take this from a standpoint of international markets, you can get variations of this, where you can talk about, kind of the diversity and diffusion of the segments. So for example, if you look at a segment, the question is the segment diffuse, or is it highly concentrated? In that sense, it might have universality to it. So is it regional, global, country-based? And so I can kind of look at the target. If the target is diverse and diffuse, it's unlikely country-based segmentation is going to work, right? Because diverse and diffuse means it's actually quite widely scattered, which means that I might be more likely to have regional or global targeting. If it's a more universal type of segmentation, then I might also have a global strategy because they're the same everywhere. It's when they're kind of clustered, so yeah, they're diverse, and yeah, they're diffuse, but they're diffuse in the sense that they've got concentrations and clusters, let's say, in regions. And then the question, of course, is how do I structure the product? Well, if there's universality in demand, then what I might more than likely to do is have universality in product. If there's quite diffuse and diverse segmentation, then again, I might have kind of a modified product structure. If these are kind of concentrated, then I might have a country structured product. So all of these things are kind of going to be interrelated to one another. And as I look at the branding and the positioning of the company and its products, one of the things I'm going to be concerned about is I'm going to be concerned about what things are similar and what things are different between the markets, right? So I'm looking at it this way, and across the target segments. So as I look at, let's say, segmentation and targeting, I look at the valuation model of the customers, I look at the competitors. The question is, what are the points of parity and what are the points of differentiation? Marketing cannot really be driven, and price differentials cannot be driven by points of parity. In many cases, the points of parity become hygiene factors in markets. It's the points of difference that matter. And the points of difference can matter for a number of different reasons, but mostly because the customers have different valuation models. And what I'm doing is I'm engaging in a segmentation and targeting strategy, which is attempting to kind of focus on the things that allow me to differentiate myself from my customers. So the three important components: the targeted segments, the valuation model of the customers, and the competitive offerings of the targeted segments. And this can vary by market, and it can vary across markets. Okay, so this gives you kind of a two-dimensional way of looking at it, where the points of parity and the points of differentiation are laid out on a global basis across markets and on a market by market basis. So you end up asking the question, to what extent do the segments, preferences, and competitive offerings have points of differentiation and points of parity across and within markets? And you can think about different types of brand architectures. And we talked a bit about this as well. Again, this is an endogenous outcome associated with the markets the company serves, but you can see that, you can see the types of differences that arise in terms of the nature of the marketing. So you have kind of the branded house. This is an example of the branded house with Virgin, where there's lots of different things, which vary from healthcare to airlines to health clubs, record companies, etc. All kind of branded under a single name, and which gives you certain types of efficiencies, obviously, with, generally speaking, the brand equity, the branding associated with it. You have kind of a sub-brand model, which is narrower than this one here because these are all related types of things. You have endorsed brands, where you can see this in the Marriott case. There's kind of a set of brands, but it's endorsed by the Marriott brand. And then you have kind of house of brands, which are these types of structures, which you see particularly in fast-moving consumer goods. And when you look at the brand positioning, right, there's a whole host of different things that you can think about. And give some examples here, but this is the important things are in the questions kind of go down. And that is, who are the targets? What might be the target audience descriptors? In other words, how might I actually articulate the differences amongst the different target segments? What's the functional benefits being provided? Okay, so I've got to provide some functional benefits. What are the psychosocial or maybe emotional benefits that the brand provides? to whom and or what does the brand compete? So it's setting up the competitive aspect of the positioning. What are the complements? Okay, very few products get used alone. Even things like hair and skin products, right? The you don't necessarily just buy a shampoo. There's a whole host of other things that are being purchased in alignment with this. Um, what's needed for the customer to get full value? And why should the customer believe in the brand proposition? In other words, why is it that the proposition that's being made resonates with the target? Does it resonate because of the functional benefits and or the psychosocial benefits? Or, for example, the fact that it allows for complementarities with across, within the brand category, within the brand, as in the case, say, of something like Aveeno, which is skin and hair brand. And then you can talk about the other P, which is kind of related to the channels of distribution. And here we introduce kind of one of the core models in marketing. And while this sounds very trite, it's actually an extraordinarily powerful way to think about things. And that is that ultimately the market share of a firm is equal to the percent of people who are aware times the percent of people who try the product, given they're aware, times the percent of people who repeat using that product, given that they've tried it. And this is a nice model because one, it's very simple, but it also targets specific components of the equation with different types of things. So, for example, how do people become aware? Advertising, word of mouth, through search, and in the case of Zara, we talked about actually place by being in a location where individuals go buy it, and therefore place becomes a component of awareness. So the Zara example versus H&M was an example where place can actually complement other areas. You have different things which might affect individuals trying the product, and then a number of other things which will cause them to repeat. Something we'll come back to when we talk about digital marketing again. And in some situations, the channels are sort of key. So in the pandemic lockdown, it's the access of delivery services that became core to the value proposition. So it's not like it's just enough for the customer to be aware. You've got to have a means by which they can get the product and get the product again. And so the awareness part, you could have as much awareness as you want. If people can't get access to the product and they don't want to use it again, then your market share is going to be crap. Ditto the reverse. If people aren't aware you're there, what's the likelihood they can try and repeat? And the answer is that's small. So you can sort of see different ways in which the distribution channels can be utilized. And there are alternative to channel models, and we talked a bit about these. The big difference, of course, is related to the nature of the structure of the channels over time. Historically, single channel, multi-channel was kind of the way to go. Increasingly, it became cross-channel driven, which means that you have one retailer might have multiple modes as opposed to different retailers having different modes. And then the omni-channel model, which is the one that's coming to dominate many areas of marketing today. And so from the standpoint of thinking about channel strategy, there's a whole host of different things which are important. And we went through these, but basically, cost and capital requirements effectively drive an enormous amount. How much money does it actually cost? Control, which means that how much control do I have over things like price, volume, promotion, types of outlets, interaction with customers. Character, which is kind of relating the underlying strategy of the product with the channel strategy, the strategy of the channel providers. whether I want full market coverage or specific coverage, do I want exclusive dealerships? What is it I want? Um, Continuity, and that is, how is this thing going to work over time? How are things going to change and adapt once the customer starts changing and adapting over time? All of these things together come together in terms of sort of developing a channel strategy. And one of the key channel strategies that we talked about was franchising. And franchising arises in an environment in which you want to engage in some aspect of disintermediation of the value chain. And you also have the ability to license things. So you can license the brand name, you can license the technology or the manufacturing processes, or the process by which a house is cleaned or a burger is made. And you can control a lot of that, and protect that through legal means via patents, trademarks, and et cetera. And typically, when you look at a franchise, you see central control of the brand and IP, so kind of upfront ownership upstream. Licensing agreements, right, which means that people have to kind of keep to the role. Minimum capital requirements, so there's a co-investment associated with this on the part of the franchisor and the franchisee. Control of image, control of advertising, control of operational quality, particularly with in things like restaurants and others, and then a profit sharing arrangement. So typically, if you can license without franchising, which means that I can license the right to the use of my brand name and just sort of say, okay, well, subject to certain conditions, you can use my name. But franchising almost always exists with licensing, and simply because there are these intangible components of the ownership, which are the things that drive what's going on. And the franchising is a good example of kind of disintermediate components of the value chain, what it is that McDonald's and others control, in terms of sort of kind of the things that are happening. Much more control up here, for example, than there is down here. Anybody can kind of do DoorDash or do Uber. You don't need to get into an enormous kind of co-investment and capital requirements to be an Uber driver, but you do, for example, to run a franchise operation for McDonald's or 7-Eleven. But channels also have conflict components to them. And one of the most common reasons why problems arise is because the goals of the distributors, the goals downstream, are not the goals upstream. So there's a difference in terms of the nature of the profit equation, for the lack of a better way to think about it, between how profits are made by somebody downstream of the value chain, if they're operating down at that level, and somebody operating upstream. And this shows up in terms of general kind of issues, right? So it arises between disagreements between supplier and channel members, or between channel members themselves, particularly if you have kind of quasi-exclusive franchise operations. So a McDonald's franchisor or a Starbucks franchisor doesn't want to be that close to other franchise operations. So if you left it up to them, you would not have as many franchise operations, simply because they would make more profits by being quasi monopolies in the kind of little areas in which they control. Whereas the franchisor was going to want to do this, generate that type of conflict. It wants its own franchisees to compete against one another. It also can be internal. For example, suppliers using multiple channels, leading to internal disagreements. In other words, sales between parts of my same organization. For example, consulting operations which sell internal software services and sell the software itself. So channel conflict doesn't necessarily only arise because you've got a channel inside. If I might have an online channel and an offline channel, or kind of a retail channel, and these two things may be in conflict, but I may own both of them. And it's just the nature of the trade-offs of the returns. If I don't get the bonus structures or the reward structures correct, then I'm going to have conflict. So you also have issues around allocation of resources to the various channels. You have external conflict between suppliers and channel members. You have between two channel members, as I said before, and between channel members and the supplier, particularly when the supplier sells directly to the customer. So some manufacturers will provide their own online store, and that will compete against the operations of of whoever is selling their products at a retail level. I gave that one example of Sage, Gastrovac, and Brayville, all one company with different names. And Sage in the UK operates its own web store, but many stores sell Sage appliances, including John Lewis and others. The question, of course, is, well, when you buy from Sage directly, does that come from Sage directly? And the answer is it may or it may not. Many online stores will actually engage in a transaction at a specific price, but what they'll do is that they actually, the fulfillment of that is done by another channel member. And that's actually one way to sort of kind of get advantages of operating multiple channels and competing a little bit against your channel suppliers, but not necessarily cutting them off completely. Then we talked about pricing, and a lot of the pricing stuff is again very basic. There are a whole series of things that matter to drive pricing. We distinguish between localized factors, local environment, and technology and firm decisions. In the case of international marketing, a lot of the issues are related to the nature of various generic strategies. Am I moving into this market to make a lot of money, or am I moving into this market to kind of penetrate into the market and get minimum market share? How am I positioning myself vis-a-vis competitors? Am I doing it at kind of high price or low price? I gave the example in class of Apple in countries like India, where they were clearly playing a premium game, but they weren't engaging in penetration, because if they actually tried to penetrate the market and get a large market share, they would have real problems in terms of meeting demand. So they purposely operated a skimming strategy in premium, and typically skimming and premium and penetration economy go together, but that's not necessarily the only model. And then there's kind of entry strategies related to this, and that is, is this a lead market or a lag market? So in the case of, again, Apple in India, they were treating it as a lag market, and therefore they weren't that concerned about generating market share within that market. And then do they want to kind of go big bang, or do they want to go slow burn? Do they want to kind of rush into many markets at one time, get big economies of scale? Or do they actually want to kind of move into markets more deliberatively, according to some kind of longer strategy? So you can actually link up these different mixtures of things. And then in the terms of sort of kind of subsidiary or market control, how much pricing do I allow at the local level? Okay. Do I allow franchise operators some degree of control? Do I allow exporters and agents some degree of control? Knowing, of course, that enforcement of recommended retail prices is illegal. Direct ownership actually can solve a lot of these problems, but direct ownership, of course, has its own price. And the other aspect of this is that there are lots of things like parallel imports and counter trade. There are different types of ways of sort of kind of engaging in more sophisticated pricing models. So counter trade, I gave examples of where essentially you have a barter arrangement, or you have counter purchase. I buy things from you, you buy things from me. You have buyback arrangements, where a firm builds manufacturing system that gives guarantees of how much of it's used. These tend to be very political. They also tend to operate in areas in which there's financial liquidity. counter trade is actually massive, but it's massive within kind of third world type of countries, and also many less developed countries. Um, China, for example, for many years had a lot of counter trade going on. Russia had a lot of counter trade going on. Over time, that decreased. You also have the parallel imports problem, and that is if you have price differentials between countries, you might have, if you have exclusive distribution in particular, um, people ship products between the different countries. And essentially it can erode kind of an attempt to have a higher price exclusive distribution structure in different types of markets. But also many countries now condone parallel imports as a way of countering the power of multinationals. So a number of countries, for example, allow parallel imports of drugs. And one reason that they do that is essentially to put downward price pressure on the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And we also talked a bit about price escalation, essentially the issue there being that the added cost of exporting creates a set of circumstances in which the pricing effectively forces products into kind of the upper end of the price range. And this is one of the reasons associated with the liability of foreignness, kind of more directly, in the sense that products which could be sold locally at relatively low prices. So in this case here, a tractor being produced at $45,000. If it's shipped to Japan, it might cost 25%, 30% as much more. Whereas if it was sold internally, say in the local market, it could save some amount of money. And also, if you could internalize the distribution structure, you could capture part of the distribution and dealer markups. In essence, it simply points out that exporting is kind of not necessarily a cheap alternative. And in fact, it may be that part of the gains that you get by ownership of distribution and dealerships is actually that you get to internalize a lot of these components of this. But the main point being that this is one reason why you tend to find that luxury products or more high-priced products tend to be the first ones to start moving into new markets. So why is it, for example, when China started to open up, that the imports of automobiles were mainly higher end automobiles? And the answer was simply because they could actually support it. They're less price sensitive at the high end of the market. And then the other aspect of this, of course, was related to transfer pricing, which is a big issue, where there's an enormous amount of discussion associated with what the appropriate taxation rate is in a local environment. And I've gave the examples of Apple and Google in being able to essentially minimize their taxes quite significantly by the way in which they move money around between different locations, but also the way they charge back for things like intellectual property. Governments tend to use a variety of different means to estimate what an appropriate transfer price is, and that is a price between divisions of a multinational. So in the case of Google, in the case of Apple, these are all internal transactions, which means that they have a lot more control of this. If these were non-internal transactions, so if they were simply selling through a third party, then it'd be a lot easier. It's the fact that these are all internal transactions, which means that some sort of kind of internal made up price has to be created between whatever assets or goods or services are being shipped between one locale and another. And in this case, of course, is purchasing an ad on Google in Australia really purchasing an ad on Google in Australia? And the answer is no. It's actually purchasing an ad in Ireland. And governments go after this all the time, but they have only a kind of limited amount of leverage with respect to this. And different countries use a multiplicity of these different types of approaches. I won't go into them in details, but you can see them there. But in most cases, what governments try to do is they try to say, okay, well, if this was an arm's length transaction for which a tax, could be levied, what would that arm's length price be? But if there isn't an arm's length price, then they have to kind of come up with other kind of intermediary solutions, and this is why transfer pricing is such an enormous problem for governments, but also companies spend enormously large amounts of money on tax advisors and lawyers to basically find out of all of the possible options of transfer pricing which one is most advantageous to it. And then the last set of kind of core things that we talked about was digital marketing. And this is kind of the, a really big area today, obviously, because so much of marketing has moved onto the digital domain. And if you go back to kind of the early lectures we were giving, one of the key things that you get by customer interaction is you get data, and data has value. And increasingly data has a lot of value. And so the issue that companies have is the management of that data. And as they look at the data, they have issues, right? They have issues with, enormous amounts of data kind of sitting around, but enormous amounts of it. They have data which is kind of coming in at high rates of speed potentially. They have different types of data coming in, different rates of speed, different levels of detail, and they also have data which is kind of highly uncertain. So one of the biggest problems for companies is not that they don't have a lot of data. They do. The problem is how can they make use of some percent of this in a useful way. And this is also one of the reasons why, if you go back to what I was saying very early on in the course, kind of the ideal world is where you treat every customer as an individual segment of one. But the problem is that that's impossible to do in most sets of circumstances. And it's also very difficult to develop a strategy based upon adaptation to all 7 billion people on the planet. And therefore, what companies tend to do is they tend to want to try and take this enormous volume of data and find a means by which they can simplify it into something which is useful. So essentially, they end up with data overload. They end up with issues of data quality. They've got enormous amounts of wasted data. Very, very, very small percent of the data that is generated is ever really used by companies. So what percent that is kind of difficult to measure, but I would be surprised if companies could use 5% of the data that they actually gather. But what this does, though, is it kind of points out kind of a really important aspect of the way a company can kind of interact with customers. And there are different models. I gave you the awareness, trial, repeat model. This one is awareness, consideration, purchase, service, loyalty. Different models have different components to them. The nice thing about these types of approaches, though, is that they tell you which are the touch points with the customer. So this notion of customer touch points has become much more important. And this one here shows how different points digitally exist depending on kind of where the customer is on this journey. And another model which is kind of originated with Dave Reibstein talks about these moments of truth. Okay, so there isn't kind of an enormous amount of difference here. It's just simply looking at, okay, what's happening in that 0 moment of truth where you're searching and evaluating, what happens in the first moment of truth in which the purchase occurs, the second moment of truth in which consumption occurs, and then that third moment of truth, which is related to advocacy, which in some sense is meant to drive a virtuous circle. So you could overlap this as an example with this and say, okay, well, how do I influence this, right? If how do I get somebody aware? If they're aware, how do I get them consider? If they're considering, how do I get them to purchase? once they've purchased, how do they get them to, let's say, be involved in service if they need to be involved in service? And once they do that, how do I generate loyalty? And there's also kind of the advocacy model, which is kind of a bit stronger one, which is related to this third moment of truth. And that is this one, this here, if you looked at it here, is related to kind of reinforcement, whereas this one here is actually these individuals are doing things which affect the customers, future customers, in terms of their search. And the nice thing about internet types of communications is that they have certain sorts of kind of advantages. More personalized, participatory, more peer-to-peer, and more communal. And essentially these things work increasingly in environments in which there's a lack of trust or a lack of willingness to believe what it is that the company's telling you. And therefore you rely more on things like peer-to-peer. You rely more on communal communications through online communities. You voice your concerns or your complaints directly. And the company attempts to personalize this by generating a response quite quickly. So the digital marketing aspect of it is really kind of driven by a lot of differences in terms of the nature of how it is that people interact and provide information. And essentially what it means is it means that you get the customer becoming not only a source of data, you get the customer becoming an advertising vehicle for you. Now, the social side of things were also talked about, and we talked a little bit about stakeholders, and I've given you kind of different models of stakeholders. There's an enormous problem with standard stakeholder theory, and what we tend to try to do in terms of operationalizing this is to kind of come up with ways in which there's some degree of alignment between kind of the key stakeholders, not just the standard stakeholders, but the key stakeholders, but also something which is to some degree is operationalized. Because if you follow standard stakeholder theory, you run into the difficulty that everybody is a stakeholder. And what it does is it leads to sets of circumstances in which it is not really operational. In other words, you can't exist in a world, you can't operate in a world in which you are not making choices about the stakeholders that matter to you and the stakeholders that don't. And I talked a bit about kind of having generic models for this, and the generic models really are two. So you can think about them as having extremes. And you can manage stakeholders globally, which means that you focus on the process of stakeholder engagement, and you don't worry about the outcomes. You worry about the fact that your subsidiary and your managers are following process. And therefore, you could have stakeholder schizophrenia in the sense that who are stakeholders in one country may vary from who are stakeholders in another country. The solutions to stakeholders in one country may be different to solutions to the same set of stakeholders in a different country. It is fundamentally a decentralized model. The other extreme is to have a centralized model, and to have a focus on outcomes as opposed to process. And in this case, you don't tolerate stakeholder schizophrenia because you're focusing on purpose. And in that situation, you have a shared risk model. You tend to be much more concerned about generalized image and reputation. You tend to want to control advertising and imaging and positioning. And you also want to control the stakeholder. So if you go back all the way to that global integration, local responsiveness, transactional completeness framework, or the economics of standardization and the economics of adaptation, this also follows a similar type of logic. Managing stakeholders globally focuses on process standardization and not outcome standardization. Focusing on global stakeholders focuses on outcome standardization and not process standardization. But you can also look at utilizing stakeholders, and this is something that I've spent a bit of time working on. And essentially working to find the areas in which individuals put value on aspects of the products that you're offering in terms of their social contribution. So you're aligning the customer value model with the customer value propositions. And this could be a number. And the other is that you can use co-creation models, which allow you to integrate various stakeholder groups into product development activities in a way that actually reinforces this alignment customer value. But ultimately, there's kind of a very simple model here, right? And that is that if you're going to do well by doing good, then you got to have a model which aligns what it means to do well. In this case, we're talking about profitability, and what it means to do good. And in this sense, we focus here on the process of these types of things. And from a marketing standpoint, all of these might apply, but the key in some sense is customer value and extraction. Making the revenue type, part of the equation, and maybe the cost side of the equation, and a little bit around risk reduction and sort of kind of insurance, align to what it is that the company's doing this. And we also talked about kind of, well, how do individuals actually value social stances, how you might do this. In my own research, we found effectively it's a dodgy proposition to follow what consumers tell you. So what you tend to want to do is you want to tend to look at what individuals do. And we can kind of break this down into a number of aspects. And that is, purchasing is contextual, and therefore things like culture, country, purchasing environment matter. Individuals are very heterogeneous and don't follow simple patterns, which means that you've got to look at the segmentation in a more sophisticated way. They're rational, but they're rational with trade-offs. In other words, how do you price the components of the product when there are kind of social attributes attached to them? In what behavioral outlets do people reveal their preferences? Right? People will purchase on social functionality. The data shows that, but they won't sacrifice product functionality, and the premium they will pay is not necessarily very large. And also, people tend to have rational technological resistance, in the sense that radical changes in the product propositions don't necessarily work for them. But consumers do exist who will act on beliefs given the context, but they tend to also operate in niches. What has not happened, and still continues to not happen, is that kind of social positioning, consumer social responsibilities, has not gone mainstream. It is primarily a niche market phenomenon, and it does vary considerably from country to country and market to market. Who is a more socially sensitive consumer in one product category will not in another product category. So you really have to be quite conscious of this. And one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to say, okay, well, think about the whole process that the individual goes through. How does mood and emotion come into it? What's the nature of the decision process? Is it calculative or habitual? Are individuals making the decisions or groups making the decisions? Is it a rational process of purchase, or is it more of an impulse process of purchase? All these things come into play in terms of sort of kind of how you might impact the consumer. But the model we tend to argue for is a model which is much more oriented around context and not oriented around values. So if you look at most of the research for the last 30 years, 40 years in this area, they focused on values, beliefs, attitudes, and intentions. And it turns out that if you look at the predictive validity of these things, it's virtually zero. If you look at the impact of context on actions, it turns out that's actually quite predictive. It's very much a behavioral model of segmentation. So what we tell companies all the time is focus on the product context, focus on the selling context, and then allow that to generate actions and from that use reinforcing mechanisms, which sounds a bit strange. In other words, rather than going on and generating segments of eco warriors and eco moms and and human rights advocates based upon values, we say no, don't try that. That actually doesn't work. Put people in the context in which they engage in good actions, and then use your marketing to reinforce the nature of those actions. And there are a whole series of things which are implications associated with this, which have implications for marketing. So one of the reasons I give you all this stuff is is not because of just the social implications, but because it says a lot about marketing. The first thing it says is it says, look at revealed preferences, look at experiments. Don't just look at things like surveys or statements coming from consulting companies or other groups would say 80% of consumers want to buy environmentally friendly products. Those things are actually useless. What you really want to do is you really want to focus on how individuals behave. Okay, you want to be able to sort of kind of look at what factors you can do to reinforce this. Okay, and you really want to kind of get at not so much whether individuals care, because people do care. You want to be able to sort of kind of think about this in a way that says, okay, well, how do I put individuals who might care into circumstances in which they will actually reveal to me the extent to which they care? And then consumers in this thing are only part of the equation. They're not kind of the only aspects of the equations. I can give you some more. I'll give you some more examples of that. In many cases, the consumers might think that they want to be ethical or social, but the reality is that their behaviors don't show this. But you can actually put them in context in which they will feel good about themselves, and you can use that emotional priming to get them to continue to behave in a certain way. Again, context matters, decision models matters, and as we said, proximity matters. Individuals care about things which are much more likely to affect their lives than they do, things at great distances. They simply do not care about things like global poverty and reduction and all of these types of things relative to their children's schooling or healthcare in their local community. And then the final thing that we talked about with respect to kind of the nature of marketing is the nature of metrics. And the whole point of this was that there's a very naive model, a very simple model, which is put in money, get returns out, and that gives you a measure of your return. But the problem, of course, is that there's a huge amount of complexity to this, and so this naive model doesn't necessarily really kind of give you the full mixture of things, mainly because it isn't just a direct line of sight. So one of the real problems with marketing metrics is that you don't have a clear line of sight between any single marketing investment and any single performance outcome. In fact, this is something that has been attempted to be studied in marketing for 50 years with kind of dubious outcomes. But and the other aspect of this, of course, is that there were many different ways to sort of kind of measure this. And this goes back to the touch point model, that you probably are never going to be able to get away with a single marketing metric. And therefore, what you're going to want to do is have a mixture of metrics and look for sort of kind of that mixture of outcomes with which you can honestly live with. And again, this is the touch point approach, and that is look at the nature of the things that you might be able to get information on based upon the flow through the model. And then finally, the whole point of kind of metrics in the marketing context is that there is a lot of variety, and that variety is related to the underlying strategy of the organization. Some companies have very standardized metrics. Others apply identical metrics but do different benchmarks. Some use a variety of different mechanisms or metrics in different countries. So it is horses for courses in that sense. The nature of the operation is going to affect this, whether you're using these metrics internally within a wholly owned subsidiary, whether you're doing it via franchising, whether you're measuring it across across agents and on down the line. And this model or framework of Bartlett and Goschel around kind of the importance of the market and the competence in the market. So kind of an internal measure of what the firm, what the local operation contributes, and then kind of the size of the demand in that local operation tells you, of course, that the measures will vary across these types of markets, depending on whether you're simply meant to be implementing strategy, whether you're really going to be a contributor to the organization in terms of resources, or whether you're in fact meant to be both a contributor in terms of revenues and a contributor in terms of resources. So the final point on all of this is that it's a bit of horses for courses. This complexity means that there isn't a kind of simple set of toolkits. There isn't a simple set of things that you would otherwise be applying, and to sort of say, okay, well, here's the workbook that I need to use to be able to solve marketing problems in an international context. The answer is that workbook doesn't exist, and therefore, what it means is it means that there are different mixtures of things that you can choose to do. There are different ways in which you can measure it. All of these things will be highly specific to the markets and products and consumers and context in which you find yourself. And therefore, what this course was really aimed at doing was simply to provide you with a variety of things to get you going in the right direction, not necessarily to give you all the right solutions. So I will stop there, and the next part of this lecture will be related to the case studies.